Hello and welcome to episode 363 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Ian, we find ourselves recording on a Tuesday again. We have to stop doing this.
We do indeed. Circumstances have brought us once again to recording on a Tuesday. And the circumstances were originally good. They were because you are in Los Angeles, along with a host of other wonderful people enjoying.
I think all the wonderful people are here, except for you, for some reason.
Good catch, good catch. I'm enjoying the dulcet tones of spring break with my children. But you are in Los Angeles as a guest of United Airlines because they've unveiled a whole host of things to their aircraft, onboard product, and route network, and all sorts of things that we are going to talk about later in the show. You've got a segment coming up with some good folks from earlier today there.
Yes.
Then we come to the other reason we're recording on a Tuesday, which is the collision between a CRJ 900 and a airport rescue firefighting truck at LaGuardia Airport in New York. So let's get into that story. We're a few days removed from that crash, and we've had a few NTSB briefings, so we know a little bit more, but not much. So
we know enough to be angry, I think, at this point.
We do indeed know enough to be angry, or at least thoroughly confused and concerned at the same time. Let's walk through what we know about the sequence of events so far, what the NTSB has been able to tell us from their investigation so far, and some of the things that we know at this point we still do not know. On Sunday, March 22nd at 11:37 p.m. local time in New York, a CRJ 900 operated by Jazz Aviation for Air Canada Express collided with an airport rescue and firefighting vehicle at New York's LaGuardia Airport. The captain and first officer of the aircraft were killed in the crash. One crew member, whom we believe to be the forward flight attendant. There were two flight attendants on board, one seated at the forward part of the cabin, one seated in the rear. We believe the forward flight attendant was ejected from the aircraft and still in their seat during the crash. And that flight attendant, as well as 40 passengers, were taken to area hospitals with varying levels of injuries. The two firefighters inside the truck were also injured and taken to the hospital. So what was happening at the airport that led to the collision, and what was going on in the background? The firefighters were being dispatched from the firehouse on the west side of the airport to the east side of the airport because United Airlines Flight 2384 had twice rejected its takeoff. After the second rejected takeoff, they called the tower and informed the tower that they had an indeterminate smell on board. Not quite smoke, but just
something
an odor of some kind.
Out.
So there was some questions about what they wanted to do. Did they want to go back to the gate? Yes, they were trying to get back to the gate so they could get the passengers off the aircraft. There was a bit of back and forth trying to arrange which gate the aircraft would return to. And if the aircraft could not immediately return to the gate, they were going to request air stairs from the fire department so that they could deplane the passengers on the taxiway and then bus them back to the terminal. So the ARF trucks were being deployed based on that event. From the fire station that is off of taxiway Delta on the far west side of the airport, all the way to taxiway Bravo, a beam runway 13 on the east side of the airport. So they had to drive across much of the airfield, including crossing runway 4, which is where Air Canada Flight 8646 was landing. So they were responding to that call, trying to cross runway 4. The aircraft was arriving from Montreal and cleared to land on runway 4. The truck and company, so there were multiple vehicles as part of this detachment that were being cleared to cross runway 4 at taxiway Delta. As the CRJ landed and continued its landing roll, the tower controller can be heard telling a nearby Frontier flight to hold its position and then telling Truck 1 to stop multiple times. The fire truck entered the runway at taxiway Delta and then was struck by the CRJ, demolishing the front part of the CRJ from the nose all the way back to door 1. So a large portion of that aircraft was just demolished.
Yeah, absolutely tragic. I'm sure you've probably all seen the images and videos, whether or not you really want to. These days, you don't seemingly have a choice whether or not you see it. But just absolutely horrifying imagery. Thankfully, the firefighters weren't gravely wounded because a fire truck is built to withstand a hit like that. It is a robust thing, whereas the nose of CRJ 900 not built for an impact of that nature, and it never stood a chance, unfortunately. And just, it's tragic. But we know some more now than we did yesterday and the day before. The NTSB, the amazing experts they are at what they are doing. What do we know so far? Why am I angry right now? I know why I'm angry, but let's tell the audience why we should be angry.
So what the NTSB provided today was a relative timeline of events based on the end of the CVR recording. So yesterday, on Monday, the 23rd, the NTSB recovered the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, and those were immediately transferred to the NTSB labs in Washington, D.C. They have had a chance to listen to the CVR recording, but they have not yet auditioned it. We'll get there in a minute what that specifically means. But they've listened to the recording and today provided at their briefing this afternoon a relative timeline based on the end of the recording of the CVR. So they provided a timeline for the last 3 minutes. And we'll put a link to the full that full timeline in the show notes. But I want to focus on the last 10 seconds prior to the end of the recording. So 10 seconds prior to the end of the recording is when the aircraft is about to touch down. At 10 seconds prior to the end of the recording, there's the 10-foot enhanced ground proximity warning system call out. 9 seconds before the end of the recording, the tower tells Truck 1 to stop. 6 seconds before the end of the recording, control of the aircraft is transferred from the first officer who had been flying the aircraft to the captain. We don't know anything more than what the NTSB said, that the aircraft controls were transferred from the first officer to the captain. At this point, we don't know anything more than that. 4 seconds before the end of the recording, the tower again tells Truck 1 to stop. And then at 0 seconds is the end of the recording and ostensibly the collision between the aircraft and the truck. The CVR and FDR were in good condition, and then the full audition of the CVR will be done tomorrow, Wednesday. There is 25 hours of audio. And as someone noted today, this might be the first accident in which a 25-hour CVR comes into play. Not that it's necessarily important for this particular investigation, but this might be the first time that a CVR with that length in recording is.
Yeah, that's interesting too, since this was maybe a 20-year-old aircraft, and for it to have the 25-hour CVR is quite positive news. Of course, in this case, it doesn't really matter, but this was not a new build aircraft. Good to see that it had a modern 25-hour recorder on board. So that is an interesting twist.
Yeah. And so what they'll do tomorrow at the NTSB laboratory is they will audition the CVR. That means the CVR group will listen to the recording and discuss what they are hearing and determine what each and every sound is coming from each and every microphone. What does that click mean? Can we determine what warnings were going off? Was there an utterance of surprise from the first officer or from the captain? What do the sounds that the ambient microphones are picking up? What are those sounds? And that will all be put into a transcript, which will then be released as part of the NTSB's investigatory docket. We will never hear that recording. That's not how it works. That never happens. The actual recordings are never released to the public. And if you want to hear more about why that is and how the NTSB treats these recordings, we always say go back and listen to the interview that we conducted with Sean Payne, who is now the leader of the NTSB's recording division. But we recorded that interview a few years ago now, and I think it's worth a listen if you're interested in how this process actually works. The FDR itself has 80 hours of data, and that will begin read out on Wednesday as well. Additional information shared by the NTSB today is why Jason is upset. We know a few more things about the situation on the airfield. We know that the runway stop bars were working. So those stop bars indicate activity on the runway. So
activity meaning an aircraft is coming or going.
Something is on the runway.
Something is happening, and only that aircraft should be on that runway.
And if you see the stop bars illuminated, you should not enter the runway, regardless of what clearance you may or may not have. The other reason that Jason's upset is that the ARF truck did not have a transponder. And it's too early to say whether or not the truck having a transponder would have changed this next piece of information. But the ASDE-X, so the Airport Surface Detection Equipment Model X, which is a high-fidelity, multi-technology system designed to keep track of everything on the airfield, including vehicles, aircraft, everything, anything moving. That system did not alert the tower to a potential collision because the system was overwhelmed by data. And I want to read this direct quote from NTSB Chairwoman Jennifer Homendy, who was quoting the FAA technicians who analyzed the ASDE-X playback. Quote, ASDE-X did not generate an alert due to the close proximity of vehicles merging and unmerging near the runway, resulting in the inability to create a track of high confidence. So vehicles here is the important word, because we're not just talking about one fire truck. We're talking about a complement of vehicles that is dispatched to an emergency. And this includes fire trucks, command cars, maybe a stair truck. It could be
Airport
ambulances.
Authority vehicles, anything.
Yeah, it could be anything. We don't know the exact makeup of the vehicles that were being dispatched. But what we do know is that because these vehicles, or at least the truck one, did not have a transponder, we don't know how many of the vehicles had transponders or if any of the vehicles had transponders. But Chair Homendy said that the ASDE-X display showed two, quote, blobs as radar targets because you're relying on radar rather than any transponder interrogation for these vehicles. And so none of that provided enough confidence in the system for the system to say, hey, this is a conflict, stop this.
And it isn't necessarily that the equipment wasn't working, it's that the equipment didn't have the confidence of data it needed to not trigger a nuisance alarm. Because if a system like this is constantly alerting controllers that, hey, something's on the runway, hey, something's on the runway, but that's not actually the case, you're worse off in the long run because controllers will just ignore these false positives consistently to the point where there will be an actual alert that they'll just ignore because they're so used to false positives with a system like this. But between the ARF truck drivers violating the stoplights and ASDE-X not picking up the surface vehicles because they did not have a transponder, this is why I'm so mad, because there are layers and layers of redundancy and technology in place to prevent exactly this situation from happening. But enough pieces of the puzzle were missing that there were enough holes to let something slip by and to let a tragedy happen. And to me, this is personal. This is my home airport. On an airline I fly, on a route I fly, And I was there at LaGuardia at around that hour just a few days earlier. So it's personal to me and it's scary. Things like this shouldn't happen. And I personally, of course, and I'm sure the NTSB would want to know why this aircraft rescue firefighting piece of equipment did not have a transponder. It's not a budget thing because the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has infinite money and infinite resources at its disposal. But I think this is the case at a lot of North American airports, really US airports. It's that I don't think it's all that common or typical for ground vehicles to be outfitted with transponders. If you look at Flight Radar 24 or any of the tracking service at a lot of European airports, Canadian airports, you will see all sorts of equipment, not just with transponders that might have information that the tower can pick up, but on ADSB as well that we can see. These are fuel trucks, airport administration vehicles, snowplows we famously see in the winter. Well, you'll see 10 snowplows side by side clearing the runways. This is just not something you see at US airports in particular. And is this just one of those things that US airports don't do because someone hasn't explicitly mandated that they have to do? Or why, basically? I want to know why an entity like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey doesn't use its infinite amount of money to put a transponder on its emergency vehicles that are moving all around the airport at all times. You can't get anywhere at LaGuardia, practically speaking, without having to cross an almost certainly active runway. There is no way to get around those runways. There are no taxiways that go around the edge of runways at LaGuardia. So I'm just personally kind of taken aback by, we have a crash at an airport with loss of life, people that unfortunately they died because of this. Why? That is something I hope the NTSB looks into, is why did the Port Authority not equip these vehicles with technology that could have prevented it? But Ian, we were also talking about something interesting. Again, only happens in the US.
Yeah.
You take it.
So the one thing that we didn't talk about yet with regard to...
But have talked about before a number of times.
We have talked about this before, is the... I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's a US centric. And anytime this happens, we get comments from folks not based in the US that are near apoplectic that this ever happens. But I want to read a little bit more of the timeline, because the CVR timeline that the NTSB released starts at 3 minutes and 7 seconds before the end of the CVR recording when the aircraft checks in with the tower. 2 minutes and 45 seconds before the end of the recording, the aircraft lowers its landing gear. 2 minutes and 17 seconds, the tower clears Jazz 646 to land runway 4, number 2.
Which means this crew was cleared to land at LaGuardia in Queens. Wow, they're probably still over Brooklyn. They're not even in the same borough or flying over the same borough of New York when they're cleared to land. They might even still be over the ocean at that point, to be completely honest, or over New York Harbor. Just, that is such a tremendous amount of time to clear an aircraft to land. Minutes. And obviously we see it. 2
minutes and roughly 7 or 8 seconds before touchdown.
So much can and does happen in 2 minutes and 17 seconds that, yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to get people writing in again and say, I cannot believe it is not just a practice in the US, but common accepted practice for flights to be cleared to take off in sequence number 2 or 3 or 4, because at that point it's meaningless. It's just procedure at that point where it has no actual application other than checking a box. I don't think this crash will change that behavior, but it is as baffling now as it is every time we talk about it becoming a problem.
So 2 minutes and 17 seconds before the end of the recording, the tower clears them to land runway 4. Then 21 seconds before the end of the recording, Truck 1 and company are cleared to cross runway 4 at Delta. So almost 2 minutes go by from the time the aircraft is cleared to land and the time the truck is cleared to cross the runway. And the aircraft has not yet landed.
No. So 2 minutes before they would indeed have actually been over Brooklyn, probably an aircraft I would have seen right out of my window. Not quite over the bay, but very close. It's just 2 minutes is an eternity. And I hope the NTSB has something to say about this. Not that anyone of any position will listen, but this has got to be such a massive part of the chain of events here.
Yeah. I really hope that we get to learn more about how the NTSB looks into this practice.
What they're also going to be looking into is air traffic controllers at LaGuardia.
Yes.
So it feels like we're having the same discussion that we did after the crash at DCA. LaGuardia and National NTC are basically twin airports. They are in extremely busy airspace. They are in downtown northeast cities with intersecting runways. They're essentially twins of each other. We know what happened at DCA. Controllers were overworked. They were understaffed. They were pumping in aircraft at a rate probably that we know was too high. Slightly different circumstances at LaGuardia. This happened shortly before midnight, where there is actually a quite low traffic. There's almost no departures at that hour. Very few arrivals, because for most of the year, LaGuardia actually has a midnight soft curfew. Not this time of year, but there's very, very little going on. And this was a big part of the initial discussions of, oh no, there was one controller working ground and tower. Well, there may have been one controller on frequency, but we know now, I believe, Ian, that there were multiple controllers in the cab at least, but potentially one working the radios at that time.
Right. So here's what we know so far about the controller situation in the tower, and here's what we don't know yet. What we do know is that there were two people in the tower cab. There was a local controller and a controller in charge. The controller in charge is responsible for the overall safety operations in the controllable area for the tower. They were working the clearance and delivery, so providing clearance to departing aircraft.
Of which there wouldn't have been much of any at that hour.
The local controller was working the arriving and departing aircraft, moving about on the active runways. And what we don't know yet, and what the NTSB is still trying to determine with certainty, is which controller was working the ground. So who was the ground controller at that point? Who is the person that was responsible for coordinating movement on the taxiways that are spread throughout the airfield? They don't know that for certain yet. So that we do know there were two people in the cab. We do know that they were both doing jobs. What we don't know is who was doing the groundwork. But what we also know is that consolidation of those positions is standard operating procedure at LaGuardia for the mid-shift, as opposed to at DCA, where there's a set of procedures that the air traffic control organization has to go through to determine whether or not sufficient conditions exist to consolidate those positions. So it's a bit of a different thing, because as Jason mentioned, this is a period of time where the airfield is not that busy. So it is standard operating procedure to consolidate these positions. That said, the NTSB is still looking into who was the ground controller, who was acting as the ground controller at that time. And that's information we do not yet
have. So we have another tragedy in overburdened Northeast Airport. Hopefully we will learn as much as we can from it, prevent it from happening again. You hate to take lessons out of an incident like this that should never have happened, but we all say that aviation regulations are written in blood, and there's just been a lot of blood spilled recently, and it's just unnecessary. Really hate to see stuff like this that should just never have happened. But when the NTSB puts out its initial report within about 30 days, we will talk about it again.
Yeah. So if we learn materially more information before next week's episode, we'll discuss it then. But yes, we do look forward to reading the preliminary report when we can. Let's shift focus back to what we've been talking about for the past few weeks, as we are now in week 4 of the war in the Middle East. We have some updates on what is happening not to the airspace in the region, because that hasn't changed, unfortunately. Most airspace, large swaths of airspace are still closed. Much of the airspace is still restricted, but we are now starting to see more commercial effects of the closure of airspace, the closure of airports, the lack of demand. What we're seeing this week, or what we've seen over the past week, is Qatar Airways parking 20 jets at Teruel in Spain. There are now 20 Qatar Airways aircraft in what is an airport that is consistently used for long-term storage. They range from a good chunk of the A330 fleet for Qatar to 777s, A350s. We're seeing aircraft flown from Doha. There was one that came in from LAX. So it operated a commercial flight and then from LAX flew to Spain for storage. Oof. We could see more at some point throughout the week, but there aren't currently any scheduled to move at the moment. So that's the largest example of aircraft in storage. There are also aircraft just sitting at airports. Thinking about airlines like Emirates, they're subfleets, so the fleets of specific aircraft types. The A350s are operating about half capacity. The A380s are a little bit over half capacity. It will come, I don't think, as much of a surprise that the Emirates freighter fleet is operating as much as it can and near the pre-war averages for flight activity. The 777-300ERs, those are down as well, just a little over half. So still a lot of aircraft sitting on the ground.
Yeah, it's basically like a mini COVID event, but just for the Middle East. Like it feels like just a couple of days ago, I was working with Qatar in my actual day job, where they were very focused on very different things like Wi-Fi and seats. And suddenly now it's back to the early 2020s where they're having to figure out where to put their aircraft because you can't keep them in Qatar too long because it is not a hospitable place for long-term aircraft storage.
And unfortunately, in this particular case, not just because of environmental factors.
That too. You really don't want aircraft there for any reason. Right
for
now.
A variety of reasons, absolutely. Elsewhere, we have entire countries warning airlines that they might have to cut their flights there because of a lack of fuel. So Vietnam was the first entire country to say from April onwards, there might need to be cuts in schedules because we don't have enough fuel for all of these flights. That is spreading a bit outside of Vietnam to Thailand and other Southeast Asian states because a lot of their fuel comes from the Middle East and through the Strait of Hormuz, which remains closed to nearly all traffic.
Yikes. This is going to get worse before it gets better because there is seemingly no path to fixing this situation that, who could have possibly seen this coming? Anyone with half a brain could have figured this out. This was going to be a direct result. This is going to hurt. This is going to hurt a lot of airlines that probably can't afford the sudden both skyrocketing of the price of jet fuel and also the bottoming out of availability of fuel right now. Not great for anyone. Certain airlines can absorb these costs, and other regions like the U.S., not so much a problem because not a lot of that fuel comes from the Middle East, or really none of it, I don't think. But for other countries, I know like even South Korea, they import all of their fuel, I think, all of their oil. So this is going to become a problem for some, not just small Vietnamese startups. It's going to be a problem soon for some major airlines. But where there are problems for some airlines, others will see that as an opportunity. And we talked about last week how SAS is already dialing back a number of maybe off-peak routes and some routes that it just won't be able to afford with fuel being so high. But then neighbors at Norwegian apparently are picking up that slack already. How opportunistic of them, let's say.
They've been able to add flights to take advantage of the cuts.
That's not nothing.
It is not nothing, and they've been able to take advantage of the SAS cuts to add flights. The low-cost carriers seem to be, for the moment, weathering this fairly well. The European low-cost carriers. This week, EasyJet said that between how their route structure is focused and their fuel hedging and contracts, they've been able to weather this storm thus far. But they did say the longer this goes on, the less we're able to absorb the impacts. And obviously, ticket prices will rise.
Yeah. Apparently, Norwegian was able to do this because it had canceled a number of Middle Eastern routes to free up aircraft, which it could then deploy to, the famous cities that you might vacation to from Europe. So Malaga, Las Palmas, other places like that, according to this Reuters article. So it's not that they magically spun up a bunch of 737s out of nowhere, but they were also impacted, and they had aircraft on the ground that needed to go somewhere else to make some money.
Exactly. Let's take a break and come back, and we'll head to LA where Jason is, and we'll go back in time a few hours and hear from Jason from a few hours ago when United unveiled a whole bunch of stuff today, and get a take from Jason, Ned Russell, and John Ostrower. So stay with us. We'll be back with them in just a moment.
Hello, I'm joined with Ned Russell of freelance wherever he is these days.
Independent aviation journalist.
And someone you may have heard before on our own show, John Ostrower of The Air Current.
So good to be back with you guys. Been a long time.
Been a minute. You've actually spun up your own podcast in that minute.
I like podcasting so much. We started our own, right?
And it's good. You should listen to it if you haven't, which is also me, because I don't listen to podcasts. But, gentlemen, where are we right now? Ned, where are we?
We are sitting on the first CRJ 450, which is a modified CRJ 200 for United Airlines, due to enter service later this year. Fall.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a weird airplane. If you're familiar with United Express, you may have heard of the CRJ 550 before, which is kind of a derated CRJ 700 taken down from, 76 seats down to 50. Now they've taken a CRJ 200, everyone's least favorite aircraft in the world, and lopped off 9 seats on board.
Well, I don't know. The ERJ 145 ranks up there.
I'm a fan of the 145.
That's a whole other conversation.
Okay, yeah.
But they've introduced first class and economy plus. John, tell me about this aircraft.
Well, it is a CRJ 200, and for all of us who have loved and been abused by the CRJ 200, United has put their own spin on it with, again, 41 seats. So they took out the 9 in the front and economy and put in 7 first class seats and got rid of the bins in the front and added a coat closet, and it doesn't feel like a CRJ 200 as much anymore. I mean, the windows are still at your ankles, but...
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite buy the line of it feels like a private jet, because you're still on a CRJ 200 at its heart.
As long as someone can still buy a tuna fish sandwich and sit next to me, it's not a private jet.
It's at least just fascinating to me that an airline has spent literally any time thinking about the experience on a now sub 50-seat regional jet, because this aircraft, they say, will also get Starlink Wi-Fi just like the rest of the fleet. It will get USB-C power eventually. These things, up until earlier today, were not something you'd ever find on a jet of this size. Why do we think they're doing this?
Well, it's part of this larger move by United to capture more of the premium market by being able to offer 7 first-class seats on their shortest routes, like Chicago O'Hare South Bend. Then the argument by their leadership is those passengers will then pay for business class or first class on longer flights, and they'll become part of this premium ecosystem. It's a bet on the future of premium travel, but Scott Kirby, CEO of United, has been telling us today that he thinks that the market is underserved right now, and it's not actually growing. It's just airlines are expanding the supply of premium seats to meet the existing demand.
Speaking of premium experience, right off to our left, outside of the tiny little wing of this CRJ, whatever this is a brand new, not yet even in commercial service, 787-9. John, tell me about it.
787-9, it is almost half business class seats. As far as the cabin goes, this is going to be the first 787-9 in the fleet with the new business class, which is, what did they say, 88 seats? Something like that? 80-something seats? I don't remember what
something along those lines.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a big number. And yeah, I mean, it's all part of the same premiumization trend. And when you pair that with the fact that they've got a route network that's going to pretty much everywhere, they really see an opportunity there. I mean, look, the reality is that a K-shaped economy means people who have the resources are going to want to take advantage of the front of the cabin. And they're designing to that.
Absolutely, but they're even offering more for the people who aren't necessarily the front of the cabin. They've got the new thing called the United Relax Row, which is, they've taken Air New Zealand's Sky Couch and they're installing it up to 12 rows in every 787. And that's, like Andrew Nacella, the chief commercial officer, said, they're trying to offer improvements for everyone from the front and the back. And I think there's also a lot of people who maybe have the means to travel but aren't necessarily going to be traveling the very front of the plane.
Yeah, they pulled a one more thing on us here at the press conference today, where the last thing they announced actually was, if you're familiar with Air New Zealand's Sky Couch, basically their own iteration of that, what do they call it, the United Relax Row?
Yes.
Coming first to 787s and then eventually some 777s. So there's, 8 different bespoke versions of a seat basically on that aircraft. You have regular economy, relax row, economy plus, premium economy, business studio. What is that, 6 or 7?
7.
So that's 7 variations of seats, and then the pilot seats up front and jump seats.
Not quite as complex as Lufthansa's new Allegris, but still.
But critically, these are certified.
Yes,
and you can actually book them and sit in them, and they will fly, which is something they've been talking about a lot. Certification is not easy, and this product also is not particularly simple. There's actual multiple variations like Allegris on this aircraft, where the middle section in the forward cabin, I think these seats face, your feet are closer together, but in the aft cabin, the middle seats, your head is actually closer together, which is really interesting. And they spin it as there's something for everyone. If you want to sit in that, you can go up front. If not, you can go in back. John, there was a particularly noteworthy comment by Scott Kirby, United CEO, earlier today. I'm not even going to have to mention the topic because I know you know what I'm talking about already. What was that about?
Scott Kirby was asked his view on airport shuttles, particularly with eVTOLs. And that's probably the single most promising market, one of the single most promising markets for eVTOLs, which are very much still under development. And Scott Kirby did not mince words. He said, I don't think there's really, they're going to fit in the airspace operations that we have right now, given what happened at GCA, given the complexity of airspace management, given congestion generally, that they haven't yet proven that those eVTOLs can slot seamlessly.
Yeah.
Well, super awkward. Archer, their partner in eVTOLs, is here with a giant full-scale mock-up of Midnight, the aircraft that's currently being developed, for this purpose. So yeah, it was unexpected, a little awkward for Archer and United, and honestly, it was a bit of a bombshell.
It was unprompted, too. It wasn't a response to a question. This was a part of a scripted Q&A.
Yes. Yeah, it was a very structured Q&A, and he just went ahead and volunteered that. But I think he's thinking aloud in terms of how a lot of folks are thinking about eVTOLs right now, and sort of how long they're taking to come to market, and everyone's moving at the pace of the FAA, and the FAA is notoriously conservative on all these things, whether it's, just day-to-day operations and certification, or, the bigger picture on how you put eVTOLs in the U.S. airspace system. But yeah, that was incredibly surprising. And again, largely unprompted.
Yeah, and then there was the comments about Boom Supersonic, where they're basically, his only comment was, yeah, they're using those engines for data centers in Herndon, Virginia now. So that's cool. So that doesn't seem any more real now than it did 5 years ago.
But the truth is everything. eVTOLs more than Boom, but I mean, all of these felt like, even when they were talking about these in 2021, sort of long distance hopes. These are still ways out, and eVTOL companies have loved to spin their timelines. I was looking at the original 2021 release, and they said 2024 we were going to be flying on Archer Midnight eVTOLs, and here we are sitting in 2026. They're not even certified yet, let alone flying commercially, and now we have Scott Kirby saying he opposes them flying to major airspace. So what is it's pushes the ball further out.
One last topic. The A321s, the twin variants here, the XLR and the Coastliner, which I love to see an airline bringing in a new subfleet and naming it something instead of just, this is the A321. No, this is the A321 Coastliner.
And a special livery, too.
And a special livery. Yeah. And in the press release, they even said, plane spotters out at LAX will see it, and they'll know what a Coastliner is. sad to see that it's really the direct successor to the 757, so it does put a clock on the 75. As those come in, 75s will come out. What does that mean to you, John?
Well, look, I think that this is the long arc of the 757. I mean, this is the final transition for those airplanes out of United's fleet, where the XLRs are coming in and the 320neos configured in coastliner configuration. That's the death knell for these airplanes, right? It's the legacy.
You
United.
hate to hear it.
You hate to, exactly.
It's the truth.
But it is, and it's
we all knew
United.
this day was coming.
We did, and you were talking about 30+% per seat fuel burn savings, and right now that's more important than ever.
You say that as we're on a modified CRJ 200 to have even fewer seats than before.
Well, guess what? Hypothetical, what world would we be living in if there was still a 50-seat regional jet that was being manufactured, right? You can get a 180-seat single-aisle airplane from Boeing and Airbus. And so they would buy new airplanes. So the question is, at 50 seats, which again hasn't been in production for ages, either at Embraer or Bombardier, this is what the options look like.
Final thoughts?
I like what United's doing. I have questions about the strength of premium long term, but it's management here seems confident. So yeah,
John,
I think that it's going to be interesting to see how they manage the complexity of all this. Right? There's so much going on. I mean, airlines are complex to begin with. So it's, how you actually handle, 7 different, physically different products on a wide-body aircraft, all the revenue management around the new relaxer. There's just a lot going on. Granted, I think they want there to be a lot going on. They don't want to be like 2002 Southwest Airlines, right? Like, this is not like a one-size-fits-all. And there was a place and a time, but I think they see the U.S. economy trending in a direction, and they see that people want to spend their money this way. And so they want to be there to accommodate that. And look, I think that they're taking risks, and I think that is something that is really encouraging for the rest of the industry, because I think you want this industry to be taking risks. I mean, it's, like...
You want it to stay exciting.
Oh, yeah. Well, absolutely. And I think that, look, the moment it becomes boring is the moment I hang up my spurs. But until then, it's damn exciting.
And on that note, we promise we're going to bring you an air show, AvTalk mashup at some point before John hangs up his spurs when the industry gets boring.
Yeah.
Which, honestly, I don't think is going to be tomorrow, but stay tuned for that. Ned, John, thanks for joining.
As
Ian,
always.
we'll toss it back to you.
Welcome back. Lots of good stuff in Los Angeles. I'm very disappointed that I couldn't make it out there.
Well, we missed you, but I feel like United could have taken all of the things they announced today and stretched it out over an entire year and trickled a bunch of that stuff out. Like, here's our fancy new 789. And then 2 months later, here's our 321 XLR. And then 2 months later, here's our 321 Coastliner. And then 2 months later, here's our CRJ 450. Literally made it up. Didn't exist before. Not even a real thing, but here it is. 2 months later, here's our version of Sky Couch. Just a whole bunch of stuff. Actually kind of nice to see it all at once and be able to see most of it in person, but really, really nice event. Happy to see all of it. Unfortunately, the 321s were not here because they are still being assembled like a big old Lego in Hamburg. So look forward to seeing those in the near future.
I'm excited about some of this stuff, and I hope we get to try some of it out in the air when it takes flight.
You don't live on a coast, though, so you're not going to see the Coastliner much.
Yeah, well, there's that.
Only 757-300s for you.
Ooh, and CRJ 450s.
Yeah, if you want to fly to South Bend, sure.
Who doesn't?
Yeah, who doesn't? That's true.
Where's Kalamazoo in the mix?
Don't forget Gary, Indiana. You need first-class seats to fly Chicago to Gary, Indiana.
Oh, boy, oh, boy. The U.S. FAA and DOT have finalized rules that put into place basically rules that would have prevented the mid-air collision in DCA in January 2025.
Wonderful.
These new rules ban the use of visual separation between helicopters and other traffic in high traffic airspace. So around airports like DCA or LaGuardia or O'Hare. they are now required to use radar separation in those areas to maintain lateral and vertical separation between those aircraft. So this follows basically a safety review by the FAA that began shortly after the DCA crash and culminated with this new rule that enforces radar separation rather than visual separation.
So by visual separation, we mean kind of the classic see and avoid situation, yes, where you are cleared into an airspace, and although there is ATC monitoring the airspace, it is up to individual pilots to basically not fly into each other, which in some very busy airspace like LaGuardia, DCA, or Chicago turns out to be quite difficult because there's just so much traffic, and we've seen that that doesn't always work out so well. This seems to have happened quite suddenly, this rule being put into. Didn't I see some controversy that it wasn't really wasn't expected at exactly the time it was put out, or did I misread that situation?
I'm not exactly sure, but it did kind of come not out of nowhere, I would say, but the announcement or the timing of it was unexpected. I mean, it wasn't paired with anything else.
Yeah, it's definitely going to make movement around very busy airspace like this a whole lot more difficult, I guess, for helicopter pilots in particular, or VFR traffic, just Sunday joyriders going along the coast. But
in one particular example, there is a massive amount of helicopter traffic in Las Vegas. Not only are there tours above the Strip, there are arrivals and departures from Grand Canyon tours, from just general go up and look at the area tours. There have been multiple occasions now after this rule went into place where those tours were not able to go into place because there was not enough ATC staffing to accommodate radar separation of these aircraft. So the helicopters just didn't fly.
It's a massive change. I don't know offhand if this impacts the Hudson River corridor along the Manhattan shoreline, because that is famously, or I think the East River as well, those are famously see and avoid visual separation corridors, which are massively busy between, at the higher levels, the approach to LaGuardia. Below that, you have the sightseeing helicopters. Below that, you have the transportation helicopters flying in and out of the heliports. You've got VFR traffic just going for a joyride. You have military aircraft just screwing around, seeing the sights, doing 360s over the Statue of Liberty. NYPD helicopters, all sorts of things, taking away that visual separation. There's no way any sort of controlled airspace like that is going to have enough controllers to keep all of that guided. So definitely have to take a look to see if there's been any drop in the traffic over the East River and Hudson River, because there's no way anyone in control is going to be able to keep track of all of that traffic. It's so much.
Yeah, I can foresee circumstances beyond Las Vegas, or circumstance that's already happened, where these aircraft just don't operate anymore because they don't have enough airspace. They don't have enough controllers to manage the process now with the new rules.
Yeah, we've talked about this many times, how I absolutely loathe helicopters over New York City. Not exactly the way I would want to have gotten rid of them. And I don't think that's actually the case because they're still very much out there. But yeah, I guess safety first, but doesn't seem to be the greatest outcome here, does it?
No, it does not. So we'll see what comes of this, if there are any revisions to the rules, if there are any further commercial implications, because all of this seems we're figuring it out as we go, very much so. Speaking of figuring it out as we go, last week we talked about massive TSA lines at a number of airports. One of the airports that I drew attention to was Austin, and we had a longtime listener of the show and person we know in real life, Jason, through Dorkfest. Justin wrote in and said, hey, those lines at Austin are not really out of the ordinary. Even that early.
I mean, even the ones that go like 3 hours out into the parking lot.
So he said, yes, they were much longer, but the fact that there are lines that go all the way out into the parking lot are actually not that unusual in Austin.
Does anything work in Austin?
said,
That
what?
airport is cursed.
So as it turns out, there were a few more factors beyond the lack of TSA screeners that go into this. One, the terminal is incredibly poorly designed to accommodate the number of passengers that currently move through the airport. So they're building
a tale as old as time.
Exactly. But there were also some events that led to large increases in passengers on those specific days. And then also they were missing a whole bunch of TSA agents.
Yeah. Again, you can't jump to conclusions, just like we talked about last week for me going through LaGuardia. The lines I saw there, which were massive, hours long, had nothing to do with TSA call-outs. So, yeah, you don't believe everything you see. There are shockingly more than one input here creating the output of long lines.
But because airlines are still dealing with the fallout from this, Delta came up with a very interesting way today to, I think, put a fine point on it for those who might otherwise not be impacted by the long lines. And they told Congress, hey, you're not special anymore. Here's what happened. Delta, and I assumed this, but I didn't know it had a name. And I assumed like all airlines have this, but I didn't know that it had a name and all this good fun stuff. Delta has a crew at airports dedicated to making sure that members of Congress can basically skirt the line and get through security as quickly as possible, get to the gate if they need to, get to wherever they need to go within the airport, and they help them do that. Delta said, hey, because of these long lines, because of the DHS funding not being in place, we're dealing with a whole host of things that are creating problems for us. So we are going to not provide special services to Congress anymore at the airport. You are now on your own. You can go stand in line just like everyone else.
There's nothing worse than someone special thinking they're special being told, you ain't so special anymore. Back of the line.
That's true, Jason. But what about someone who might not be that special being given something very special? Not because they necessarily earned it or deserve it, but because the airline has nowhere else to put them.
Yeah, whoops. So what happened here is explicitly forbidden in countries like the U.S., but this flight, a Transavia flight from, I believe, Egypt to Amsterdam, was oversold. Transavia flight 6134, reading this from 1 Mile at a Time, who read it from View from the Wing, news gets around, but apparently this flight was oversold. In the U.S., they would have voluntarily, or in the worst case situation, involuntarily denied some boarding, gave some compensation, gave a hotel room. But in this case, this airline was allowed to fly some people in the jump seat, not like the jump seat in the cabin, the flight deck jump seat. So apparently the flight crew polled the audience and said, who wants to come sit up front for the entire flight? And apparently a woman and her maybe about 10-year-old child volunteered and ended up sitting in the cockpit jump seats for the whole flight, which is outstanding. Absolutely outstanding. Why can't that happen to me?
Well, gestures at history.
Everything?
Here. Yeah. I mean, it used to be perfectly common for, people to visit flight deck all the time. I mean, as a kid, I remember doing it. 2001, that changes. And now we've been talking about the secondary barrier on the flight deck for the past 25 years. And some airlines are starting to fit those on in the US. So times change, things change, events happen, and we can't have nice things.
In Europe, this is totally fine. You can do this. It's up to the captain's discretion to allow it or not. And in this case, the options were leave people behind or put them up in the jump seat. As long as they're not distracting, yeah, They can fly up
I'm
front.
not going to say this was totally fine. It doesn't appear to have broken any regulations. It appears
Therefore,
to.
it is totally fine.
All right, fine. We'll leave that there.
I see what you did there.
We've talked about Finnair in the past and how they've had a rough go of it lately, but one of their shining moments has been their non-adoption of the A320neo family aircraft, or specifically the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engines on the A320neo family aircraft, because they've been completely unaffected by the groundings. And they will continue to remain so because they have placed a big order for the Embraer E195 E2. And they've announced that they're going to acquire 12 used A320 family aircraft. CEO versions.
CEO. Yeah. I guess there are plenty out there. We'll just talk to Steve Giordano about where they're getting them from. But I wonder which airline they're taking the 320 CO scraps from.
I don't know if we know that yet. Finnair has not said exactly where it is sourcing the used A320s from, or A320 family, because it'll be a combination of A320-200s and A321-200s. So that remains to be seen. However, just the complete and utter lack of want for the A320neo is just fascinating to me.
It is fascinating for an airline the size of Finnair to be still placing orders for the CO. Who do they think they are? Spirit?
Maybe that's where they're coming from.
Actually, no. Spirit needs all its COs. It can't afford NEOs anymore. You know that.
That's true. That's true. Except for, profitable growth opportunities, I think was the phrase. That's
whenever that occurs, yes, but that is not today.
Yeah. This week, it also marks the occasion of the end of COVID-related aircraft groundings for Air India. After 6 years, they have finally returned all of the COVID-era stored aircraft to service. 777 VTALL is now back in the air after more than 6 years on the ground. It went in for a C-check in February of 2020, and then COVID hit. Then they used it for spare parts. Now, after almost a year in heavy maintenance, they've brought the aircraft back and it re-entered service this week. So good for them. I mean, that was a long time coming. On the other hand, Jason.
Oh, it gets worse.
When you operate aircraft and operate different subfleets within a particular airline, you want to ensure that you have the correct permits and permissions to operate that aircraft to its destination. That did not happen for Air India this week when they sent the wrong 777, or tried to send the wrong 777 to Canada.
Yeah.
What happened?
Apparently, they tried sending one of its 777-200LRs. I believe one of the aircraft it took from Delta when Air India was first transforming itself into something that didn't suck as badly. But it had clearance to operate the 777-300ER, but not the 200LR. So on a flight from Delhi to Vancouver as AI 185, reading from the Times of India, it had to turn around, which is just unfortunately. So what was it, an 8-hour flight to nowhere, I think, give or take?
That's, I mean, not the longest flight to nowhere we've seen in recent weeks, but still, how do you, I guess as the pilot, how do you make that announcement?
Well, folks
from the flight deck, this is the wrong plane.
It's the darndest thing.
Sorry.
You won't even believe it. But hey, paperwork is important, and this is not the first time this has happened. It won't be the last time. But every time we see it, it is just as every bit as embarrassing as the last time it happened to some other airline. That's rough, but paperwork is important.
This is true. And we'll close the show with a bit of order news. Aircraft lessor AerCap has agreed to purchase 100 Airbus A320neo family aircraft, as is tradition now. This is crazy to me. The A321 for so long was so unloved. Then the A321neo comes around and everyone wants it. So this 100 aircraft order includes 23 A320neos and 77 A321neos, with deliveries beginning in 2028, stretching through 2034. The entire narrow-body fleet is going to be 321neos.
Yeah, everyone's really excited about this order except for Finnair.
How dare they order neo aircraft? Finnair's just going to be sourcing A320ceos for
forever. But not everyone's that excited about the 321. We've seen a couple of airlines scrap their orders for the 321s. Aegean recently, JetBlue. So in general, yeah, I think, the vibe at United today was very much like, we're taking 8 billion 321neos between now and 2030. So yeah, popular aircraft. And these apparently will be delivered 2028 through 2034 to whichever airline out there is willing to pay the most.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, the thing about United, I think that's worth noting is that, and other airlines still have a ton of orders for the 737-10, just kind of sitting there.
We don't talk about the 737-10. It did not actually, coming back to the United event, did not come up once at all at any point today. It's kind of a paper order at this point, even though the first 737-10 is actually a United painted, liveried aircraft. It seems less likely day by day that aircraft will ever actually happen, at least for United.
Deliveries any day now, right?
Any day now.
Certification right around the corner. Although, to be fair to Boeing, they do seem to have their act much, much, much more together lately.
Yeah, I don't know if it matters at this point. The coastliner, not to have another discussion about United at this point, but the coastliner only exists because United does not have the 737-10 and has no idea when it will get the 737-10, and the 757, as we know, unfortunately cannot last forever. So it had to do something, and now we get a 321neo coastliner. Love to see it.
There you go. All right. On that note, we will hopefully be back next week recording at a normal time. We'll see what we can do about that. But until then, this has been episode 363 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.